starting to get dark here in Spot, and as it's toward the end of the day, and I didn't want to let this day go past these. Actually, yesterday and today, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel Tammuz. These 2 days are the anniversary or of the liberation of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe's father-in-law, and the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, from Stalinist prison. And these days are, as the Rebbe has explained many times, are days of liberation for all of us because they contain the energy. Here's the thing. It's very interesting, but except for the Rebbe, every single Rebbe of Lubavitch was in prison. And there's a reason for that, apparently, because like the Alter Rebbe explained, the first Chabad Rebbe, when he was in prison, it was because his Hasidus, his teachings did not yet have permission from the heavenly court to be released into the world. So the same thing is obviously true with every one of his successors who revealed a new level, a deeper level of the Torah Tosha Mashiach, the mystical Torah, the Torah of redemption. That there's always an opposition, right? The world is created in a state of war, spiritual war, but way too often it chains down into physical war. So when the previous Rebbe was, and usually the imprisonment is even on the surface is because they're opponents. Sometimes they were Jewish opponents, sometimes many times not. Sometimes the non-Jewish opponents and the Jewish opponents to the spreading of this deepest level of redemptive Torah. Sometimes they work together. Anyway, so when the idea is that when the tzaddik is imprisoned, the Torah is imprisoned, and when the tzaddik is free, the new level of Torah that he is here to innovate, to reveal, to bring to the world is also free. So this is the case with Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz, and like every date in the Torah, when something happens on that date, it is for a divine reason, and that date holds the energy of that event, the resonance, the vibration, the potential of that event, so that every year when that day comes around, that energy is released on a deeper, higher level, and we are the ones who are invited, charged with connecting to it and receiving it, because it is through us that things come from the higher worlds into this physical world. It's through us. It's only through us. We are the channels. So I want to just use this time. I'm going to try to make this as concise as I can, because I only came on for one reason today, and that is to tell my really, truly incredible miracle story. I might have told it on YouTube once years ago. I don't remember. I rarely tell it, and the reason though a lot of other people do tell it. Sometimes people have given it as the keynote address, at certain times of the year when, the previous connected to the previous Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. And it's been told over one well-known rabbi who will remain anonymous here told me once, if I had $1 for every time I told your story at some kind of gathering or event, I would be a wealthy man. Anyway, it's a real story. And the reason that I hesitate to tell it is just because it feels awkward. Like, I don't know how many details to include, how many to leave out. I'm quoting someone else. So bear with me on that, and I'll do the best I can to include the relevant details and not those that are less relevant, although the entire thing is unbelievable. It's totally unbelievable. And you're hearing it from me. So this is a firsthand story. This is my story. So I grew up, when I was young. I was born in California. When I was young, my family lived in Chicago. My extended family lived in Chicago. My grandparents lived in Chicago. Aunts, uncles, most of my aunts and uncles and cousins. My mom came from a family of 6. She was the baby. So we lived in West Rogers Park, which is a Jewish area, and most of my family did as well. And those were happy days, and I was very close to my grandparents, especially my mom's parents, especially my grandfather. And I have very vivid memories of being a kid, sitting on his lap, time and time again, literally feeling his chest, his heart behind me, his chest moving, breathing, and feeling all that love, when you feel sometimes with a grandfather. And he would tell me stories of his early life, which seemed like fairy tales to me. But what were the stories that he told me when he was, listen to this, this is a true story. When he was 6 years old, his parents, he lived in Europe. He lived in a shtetl, in Europe. He told me, sometimes it was Russia, sometimes it was Poland, sometimes it was Latvia, but it was, this shtetl was near Vilna, and it was called Esheshuk. It just so happens many, many, many years later that the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., when it was established, they had a tower where there were thousands of pictures of a shtetl that was destroyed in the war, completely destroyed. It happened to be that it was Esheshuk, where my grandfather's family lived, and my grandfather lived. But that was later. Those pictures were from later. So he escaped before the Holocaust, well before the Holocaust. Thank God, or I wouldn't be here. Anyway, when he was 6 years old and his little brother Max was 5, his parents left. They left Esheshuk. There were no airplanes then. This was actually in the late 1800s, believe it or not. Anyway, his parents left Esheshuk and went to America, by boat to, make money for the family, to be able to bring the family over. And it took a long time. I think a lot of the family came over with them, but these 2 little boys, 6 years old and 5 years old, did not join them because their parents wanted them to learn Torah in the cheder, in the religious school there in Esheshuk. I know it sounds completely crazy. It's what we would call now Mesiras Nefesh, which really means like self-sacrifice on a deep level. Now it'd be called, I guess, child abuse, but I guess they were left, with responsible people. They slept in the cheder in the school. The community was very poor, and they ate. They had something called Essentag, where they went from every day. They had every day of the week. They had a designated house, designated family, and the 2 little brothers, 5 and 6 years old, Max and my grandfather Shmuel, they would go to a different family and they'd be fed. But my grandfather told me in this, loving fairy tale way, when I was sitting on his lap, that the families were very poor and they didn't have much food. They would give them cucumbers, and they would think to themselves, these boys could eat cucumbers for one day. They'll get fed better somewhere else. So every day they're eating cucumbers. They're learning Torah, tiny little kids standing up so they wouldn't fall asleep. They'd sleep at night on the benches in the cheder, and every 3 times a year at the holidays, they would get somehow a ride to a nearby town, like 20 miles away, where their older sister, married sister Sarah, lived, and she would take them for the holiday, and then she would knit them some socks, new socks. And other than that, they lived in this cheder until my grandfather stayed there till he was 17 years old, from age 6 to age 17. He said when his parents finally sent money for them to come to America, he met his mother, and she was a stranger. He didn't want to hug her, but that was the way it was, I guess, at the time. I've actually, now that I think about it, I've met quite a few people from when I used to live in New Jersey, from Honduras and Guatemala and whatever, that left their kids there with parents or whatever to come to make money as cleaning ladies or whatever, so that they could bring their kids eventually for a better life. But it's not an easy choice. That's the choice that they made. So my grandfather told me these stories. He was Orthodox. My grandmother was Orthodox. I used to go to the synagogue with them now and then. But my family, my mother, I said, was the youngest of 6 children. Every one of his children, though his parents were so dedicated to observant Judaism and to the Torah, the children, although he tried to educate them, were not. They did not live in a shtetl. They lived in America, and they went to public school, and none of their friends were doing what he was doing, what he was teaching them. Their parents were teaching them to do. And one by one, his children left the Torah path. And again, my mother being the baby, everyone was close to the parents, to my grandparents, but not observant at all. They thought it was archaic, beautiful, quaint, tradition, but archaic. So my Aunt Millie used to keep kosher and light Shabbos candles. That was about it. Everybody went to the Pesach Seder, the Passover Seder at my grandfather's. But other than that, we lived a secular life. Eventually, when I was 9, we moved away from Chicago to Minnesota. My father got a degree at the university. He got his professorship at the University of Minnesota, and we moved there. And at that point, I went to school. I was the only Jew. Eventually, I was in high school in my neighborhood in St. Paul, and there were 2,500 kids in my high school, and I was literally the one and only Jew. My 2 younger brothers were in that same school, but not when I was. I graduated before they started, and so they were also the only Jew in the school out of 2,500. It was never a problem with anti-Semitism or anything. It's just that we were very distant from, the life of these two kids growing up in the shtetl and learning in the cheder and sleeping on the benches and being devoted to Torah. But I was close to my grandfather. And, I had a very strong feeling of love. I remember when I was little, I promised my grandfather when I was like maybe 6, 7, I said to him, Grandpa, I'm going to keep kosher when I grow up, even though my parents aren't. So you'll come to my wedding. And, I didn't know at the time. It was prophetic. He wasn't alive to come to my wedding, but I was definitely kosher by then. Anyway, so here's what happened. I'm composing myself. This story, for some reason, is very hard for me to tell, so I hope you'll bear with me. It's worth it. So during this growing up period, when my youngest brother was 15, my grandfather had already passed away. Both my grandparents had passed away. And my parents told him, you don't have to have a bar mitzvah, Grandpa. We did it for Grandpa. And he chose to anyway. Then when he turned 15, he decided he wanted to know more. And making that long story short, he ended up, after a few tries, he ended up in the new Lubavitch community, Chabad community in St. Paul, Minnesota. He rode his bike there. He rode his bike to a synagogue that was Reform, and he didn't like it because they didn't speak enough Hebrew. And he asked them where they speak more Hebrew, and they sent him to this little place, this little shul, this little community, and they adopted him. And within several months, as he was studying, they told him, you need to go away to a religious school. You need to learn Torah. You need to keep kosher. And he convinced my parents that he should go. I was already in college at that time, so I was following this very loosely. I thought he was crazy. I loved him, but I literally thought he was crazy because I had never heard of such a thing. I had never heard of a situation where somebody Jewish grows up secular and becomes religious. Literally in my life, I never knew that such a thing existed. And I thought it was really bizarre because I understood that grandparents are Jewish. I knew I was Jewish. My mom always told me to be proud that I was Jewish. And I felt, a pride in my culture and an affinity. And again, I did love my grandparents, and my family was, at least slightly culturally traditional. But I did not know that anybody had ever grown up secular and returned to observance. So as my brother was studying in this yeshiva and coming back, and every time he came back home, he wanted to do more. So first he wanted to keep kosher, and he convinced my parents to buy him a set of dishes. And then the next time he came back, he was more kosher. So they had to throw out the dishes and get him new dishes. And, everything got stricter and stricter. And I just watched, with fondness, but with like, what is going on here? This is nuts. Anyway, after a while, he started to call me and tell me a little bit about what he was learning. He was learning something called Hasidus, which is what I call authentic Kabbalah, the tradition brought down from the Baal Shem Tov in the mid-1700s to all of his disciples, one of the primary of whom was the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad, and passed down, like I said at the beginning of this live, through each successive Rebbe of each generation, elaborating more, deeper, bringing down more of the power of this mystical Torah. This is the mystical Torah. So I didn't know Torah was mystical. There were a lot of things I didn't know. And when my brother called me and started telling me a few of the things he was learning, it really sparked me. It was as if this body of knowledge could answer questions that I had always assumed had no answers, like what's the meaning of life? Why do bad things happen to good people? God forbid. And all kinds of other things that you just figure, these are the big mysteries and no one knows the answers. So I quickly realized that Hasidus had the answers, and that we could dig in and understand more and more. Also that it was empowering. It shared, it taught us, it illuminated a lot of things about the anatomy of the soul, about what it means to be human, about how we can manage ourselves in much, much more powerful ways. Anyway, so that intrigued me, and I was interested, not that interested, but I started to get just a little bit curious. Anyway, my brother came home in the summer. I guess he was he must have been 16 then. And he convinced me to ride bikes with him about 6 miles from where we lived to the Chabad house, the Lubavitch house in St. Paul. And I didn't want anything to do with those people. I thought they were fanatics, and somehow I thought they were going to try to get me. But I was willing to go with him. I loved riding bikes, and it was a beautiful ride along the Mississippi River. And we landed at the front door of the Chabad house, and I said, I'll wait outside. He said, come on, just come. It's hot. Come on in. And, it's air conditioned. You don't have to talk to anybody. So I parked my bike outside. I walked in. And again, I'm going to tell I would love your feedback, honestly. The kind of feedback I want, if anything moves you, I'd love to hear that. We haven't even begun. This story is completely miraculous. We haven't gotten to that part yet at all. Like I told you, I feel awkward telling it because I never know how much to say, how much not to say, the details. So I would love your feedback on how it's coming across, if something should be faster or slower, not necessarily for this time, but for next time, because I think it needs to be told. Although it is published on my website and it is published in a couple of books, but it needs to be told. I mean, it is being told. It needs to be told by me. Anyway, so I walked in just right inside the door, and my brother said, I have to go talk to the rabbi. I'm like, okay, come back soon. And as I was standing there, I saw that it was a big, big room, almost like a hall. And at the other side of the room, there were a few young women, and it was a Thursday, they were making dough. They were making bread. And I found out they were making challah for the Shabbat. So as I'm standing there, one of them comes, leaves the table, sees me, walks over to me like this, and she's like, Karen, is it you? That was my English name. I was named Shifra Chana as a Hebrew name, and Karen as an English name when I was born, both of them. So anyway, this was a girl that I had met in camp a few years before. I don't remember knowing that she was Jewish, but she was there. And the fact that she recognized me, she said, come on in, come meet the people here. It's great here. Stay overnight. Anyway, she convinced me, and they all convinced me. It was so warm. There were reasons also. I had some personal issues. I was just graduating from college. I had no idea what to do with myself. My parents, shortly around that time, suddenly announced that they were getting divorced. Anyway, I was a little lost, and they were really friendly, and they convinced me to stay for the evening, then stay overnight, and then the next day, and then the next day, and then the next day. They were all there for the summer program. So it ended up that I stayed most of the summer. And then at the end of the summer, everyone left. Hi, Angela. At the end of the summer, everyone went home. All the girls went home, and it got cold. And I lived in Minnesota, and I lived on campus in Minneapolis, about 6 miles from this place, and I had no car. The bus service was terrible, and you'd have to take a couple of buses and wait half an hour in the below zero temperatures in the snow in order to get from Minneapolis to St. Paul to that suburb. So anyway, before that happened, before everybody left, this is where the story really starts. So toward the end of the summer, a Rebbetzin Yehudis Groner, who was the wife of one of the Rebbe's secretaries, Rabbi Groner, came to the place where I was. It was Lubavitch house. It was called Beis Chana. That was the name of the summer school. And she told us, you can write a letter to the Rebbe. The only thing is, and you might get an answer, she said, the only thing is that before you write, you have to make up your mind that if the Rebbe tells you to do something, you're going to do it. Because the Rebbe is a great tzaddik. He sees things that we can't see. And he's connected to every single soul, she said. So if you write, only write if you're willing to listen to the Rebbe. So I thought about it, and I did have a feeling for the Rebbe. What I didn't have a feeling for was God. I really was heavily agnostic. I wanted to believe in God, but I felt like if there is a God, I was into Eastern meditation, and I was, very lightly dabbling in Zen and whatever it was that kind of felt good to me. And it felt like there's got to be something here besides what we can see, but what is it? I have no idea. And when I was in this school all summer learning Hasidus, learning this wisdom, but the God part really stumped me. And at one point I remember asking the rabbi, does everybody here believe in God? And he said, ask them. So I turned around and every hand in the room went up. I was the only one that really didn't feel at all sure. And when I thought about God, I thought, it would be nice if there was someone in charge. It would be good, but it's too good to be true. And then I thought, even if it is true, like I'm nothing, I'm nobody. Well, if there was a God, why would he care about me? So that's how the summer went on. Then I wrote to the Rebbe about a personal problem that I had at this period of time, these 2 days when Rebbe Broner was there. And I had made up my mind. I'd heard some stories. What did the Rebbe tell people? I'd heard stories about how people came to the Rebbe with problems, and he'd say, light the candles Friday night every Shabbat. And I thought I could do that. If the Rebbe told me to do that, I could do that. Or give tzedakah, give charity every day. Okay, I could do that. So I figured, what is he going to ask me already? I'll commit myself. I'll do it. And as I said, I did have some inexplicable attraction to the Rebbe. I didn't explain this, but I took karate when I was in college for a couple of years. I was never very good, but my teacher was very good. My teacher, Sensei Robert Fusaro, had been trained in Okinawa under the highest karate masters of Shotokan karate and later and in Japan. And so he was a 5th degree black belt, and he was amazing. And he used to bring some of his karate master contacts, including the president of the Japan Karate Association, 10th degree black belt, and a 9th degree black belt, Master Nakayama, Master Nishiyama. And I remember to our dojo in Minneapolis, and they were unbelievable. I saw that they had supernatural powers. They talked about it too. One time I watched neither of those, I don't remember the name of the master, this third master who was there, but he stood in the middle of this large room in the dojo, and he had 4 2nd or 3rd degree black belts rushing him from every corner of the room at the same time as a demonstration. And literally he just went like, and they went flying across the room, all 4 of them. So I knew that there was such a thing as a master. And somehow I had the sense that the Rebbe was a master greater than all of these masters, a master of masters. So I wanted to listen to the Rebbe. I wanted to be connected to the Rebbe. I felt that there was something there. Even though I had my serious questions about God, somehow I felt connected to the Rebbe. Everybody has their path. Okay, so I wrote, and the answer came the next day. And the rabbi called me into his office, and he was dictating the letter. They were dictating the letter to him on the phone, the answer. And basically, I won't tell you word for word, but basically the Rebbe said, not that I should light candles for Shabbat, and not that I should give charity every day, but that I should begin to live a fully Orthodox life. He said, it is a true nature of every single Jew that they live in accordance with the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, and it will bring the answers, it will bring the peace of mind. So I'm paraphrasing here. And it was a long letter. It was a very personal letter, but I had committed myself that I was going to do whatever the Rebbe said, and the Rebbe basically told me to become Orthodox after I told him specifically that I didn't really believe in God. And one of the big miracles here, not the miracle that is so astounding to the listener, but to me, it's kind of astounding that I actually went through with it. And it was only years later that I realized, you did commit yourself. Yeah, but why did you listen? I never even thought not to listen. It never crossed my mind, although I didn't know how I was going to manage. Anyway, so I became observant. I became Orthodox. The problem was that I was still living on campus. I had no friends. All the girls had left this summer program. They weren't coming back for another few months, some, new ones or some of the same ones. And I was alone. And it wasn't such a problem getting kosher food, but keeping the Shabbat all by myself, not having anyone to hang out with. I couldn't any longer go to the non-kosher restaurants that I'd gone to with my friends. I couldn't go to the bars. There were a lot of things I couldn't do. I'll leave it to your imagination. There were a lot of things I couldn't do that had been my lifestyle as a regular college kid. Anyway, it got really hard. And at one point, an opportunity came up to go to a retreat that I really wanted to attend. I didn't have a car. I had a ride, but it was leaving on Friday night. So till that point, I had been finding a way to get to St. Paul. It was often hard. Sometimes I'd get a ride. I'd be there for Shabbat. It was a big hassle. Sometimes I'd stay home, and that was much more depressing, but I did it. This Friday night opportunity came up, and I'm like, I can't sustain this lifestyle. I can't do it. So maybe I just need to quit. Maybe I should take the ride to the country, to the retreat. And I thought about it, and I waited. And at the last minute, I decided I had an invitation to go to a really nice family for Shabbat, and I decided I was going to give Shabbat one last try. I'm leaving a lot of details out. Good, for your sake, but we're going to get into the meat of the story momentarily. So I went to their house, and I had a really nice time. And they told me during the lunch meal on Saturday that there was going to be an event that night at the Lubavitch house, at the Chabad house that I had first encountered this whole culture in. And that there was a speaker who was coming to commemorate the yahrzeit, the anniversary of the passing of the previous Rebbe, the Rebbe's father-in-law, who was released from prison yesterday, and today was informed on the 12th of Tammuz, and he left the prison on the 13th, which is today. Anyway, as I started out explaining here. So they told me that the speaker who was coming was a famous rabbi from Chicago, an amazing speaker. His name was Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Hecht, and that they'd been trying to get him to come to the community for a really long time, and he was going to be fascinating, and I should stay. Sleep over, stay, you'll come with us, you'll stay another night. I'm like, all right, I'm here already. I lost my ride, and I decided to stay and go with them. So night came, we went. And again, that big room where I had first seen my friend making challah with the other girls years before, not so many years before, maybe 1 year before actually, was filled with about 100 people from the community, white tables on both sides and a dais in the front. And I'm sitting there, and the rabbi walks in, the guest speaker, and he walks through the tables, and he gets up to the dais, and he stands up, and he starts to speak. And he said, during the war years, we had a fund. It was called Keren Hatzalah. And there was a branch. The fund belonged to the previous Rebbe. It was sponsored by him. But we had a branch in Chicago. And the president, among those who was there at that time, was a man by the name of Reb Shmuel Breda. And he was the president of Best Kosher Sausage Company and the president of the Keren Hatzalah. At this point, I started to cry. Maybe, as you're maybe guessing, that was my grandfather, the one on whose lap I sat and heard these stories of Shuk, who had passed away years before. Anyway, Rabbi Hecht continued. He said that Reb Breda, he said we collected at that time. I figured out later this was 1947. He said we collected at that time $180,000 to take to the refugees in Israel, and also a group of refugees in Paris, in the suburbs of Paris, who had escaped from the town of Lubavitch, which was in Russia before the war. He said that was a lot of money at the time, and the delegate to take it to Paris was Reb Breda. And he said Reb Breda came back. He took the money, he came back, and he told us that something had happened that he would never forget. So Rabbi Hecht said, what happened? That was so amazing. And Reb Breda answered, I wanted to understand how the people lived through the difficult years of the war. These people were impoverished. They were refugees. They had suffered. They'd lost everything. So he said at random, I went to speak to older people, then middle-aged and young people, young couples. Then at random, I picked a little boy on the street. I saw a little boy, and I said to him, little boy, I'm going back to America. What would you like that I can give to you before I go? And this little boy said, I would like to have the merit, the zchut, the merit to go someday to America and see the Lubavitcher Rebbe. That was what he would never forget. So Rabbi Hecht asked him, what is so amazing about this that you'll never forget it? He said, these people had nothing. This little boy had never met the Rebbe. Maybe his parents had never even met the Rebbe, because the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, had moved from the town of Lubavitch in Russia to a Polish town at Busk 30 years before. And yet he said, I thought that I would have given this child anything he wanted. I would have given him candy, food, a suit, a hat, shoes, a toy. And he didn't ask for any of that. He didn't know I was going to ask him this question. A little kid, 8 years old, on the street. He said, if a Rebbe can leave such an impression, if a human being can leave such an impression amongst his followers, that their children grow up and care more about that connection than anything in the physical world, this is something the world has not yet seen, has never seen before. That was the story Rebbe Hecht came to tell. Oh, I left out the first part. He started out speaking. He didn't start by telling the story. He started out by, I don't know why I have so much trouble doing this. He started out by saying that the previous Rebbe constantly used to quote the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, who would always say that whatever a person sees, he's meant to see. Whatever he hears, he's meant to hear. It's called Hashgacha Pratit, or Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence, that God is directing everything. And when a person experiences something striking, something that makes a serious impression on him, that's always a special lesson for him. And he said that the Baal Shem Tov actually used to go up to people and ask them the question, "Was gedenkst du?" What in Yiddish? What do you remember? Like, what in your life has hit you? And then he would explain to them what the personal message was. So this is the first thing Rabbi Hecht said. And then the second thing he said is, I am so happy and gratified to be here in this room with a beautiful community of young families. Rabbi Feller, the rabbi of the head shaliach, the head Lubavitch rabbi in Minnesota, has been trying to get me to come for 10 years, and we just never found the time. So I sat there in my seat. The first thing that happened to me was I was sitting there thinking that, wait a minute, I could have not been here. I almost took a ride to this retreat, and I just at the last minute decided to try Shabbat one more time. And then I might not have even known about this event, and here I am. How did that happen? I wonder if that's Hashgacha Pratis. I wonder if that's divine providence. So that was the first thing that happened. Then he told a number of stories without mentioning anybody's name. Then he told this story about my grandfather. And that was the end of the story, except that he said Rebbe was not a chassid. He was an Eisheshaker. And Eisheshak was not chassid. Now, of all the people in the room, nobody had heard of Best Kosher Sausage Company. This is my grandfather's company. Nobody had heard of Eisheshak except me when I grew up on my grandfather's lap hearing all these stories of Eisheshak, this shtetl that was destroyed in the war. Why would Rabbi Hecht say that? So I'm sitting there crying. The rabbi of the community, Rabbi Feller, is looking at me, and he mouths to me, "Your grandfather?" And I'm like, "Yes," because we had been talking about my grandfather just the week before. And he said, "Mark my words, Shifra Chana, you became religious because your grandfather did a favor for the Rebbe. You don't know what it is, but I'm telling you." I'm like, right, sure. Maybe it was 2 weeks before. So I'm sitting there like totally like melting down, and he's looking at me, and he tells Rabbi Hecht, the speaker, what just happened, that the granddaughter of Reb Broida is in the room. Now, it's also interesting that Rabbi Hecht mentioned my grandfather's name 7 times. I know that because I actually have a tape. I have to get it converted. In all these years I haven't, but I have a tape of this story. And so I know how many times he said Reb Broida, Reb Shmuel Broida, Reb Broida. Was 7. He didn't mention any other name in any of the previous stories that he told about the previous Rebbe, just this name. So this is the end of what he thought he was coming to present. I went up to the dais, and I'm shaking, and I asked him, "Is there anything else that you can tell me about my grandfather?" And he said, "Your grandfather and I weren't best of friends. I later found out that my grandfather was very opposed to the Hasidic movement, and he was influential in Chicago. So before this time, they were not friends, but after that, they became friendly." Amen. Activated pineal. Amen. Anyway, so he said, "There's one other thing that I can tell you. And that is, after this event, after your grandfather came back and told us this story, had this experience, he asked me if there's any way he could meet the previous Rebbe." And he said the Rebbe had been tortured by Stalin. He'd been imprisoned, and he was tortured, and he was thrown down the stairs, and he was broken physically. and it was very hard to get into him, but he said, I arranged it. I took your grandfather to New York, they lived in Chicago, to meet the Rebbe. And it was 1947, so I guess 3 years, 2.5 years before the Rebbe passed away. He said, your grandfather came out of this private audience and told me that it was one of the most incredible experiences of his life. But here's where the punchline is coming. He said, after that, the Rebbe called me into his office. Now think about this, guys. Doctors keep confidence. Lawyers keep confidence. Rabbis keep confidence. Priests keep confidence. A Rebbe who connects to souls, how much more so? Yet the Rebbe called Rabbi Hecht into his office and told him, Rebbe was by me today, and I asked him about his community work and his business, and we talked. And then I asked him, was tun eure Kinder? What are your children doing? And he burst into tears. The previous Rebbe, saying this to Rabbi Hecht, and Rabbi Hecht was telling me. Why did he burst into tears? If you missed the beginning of this, because he had 6 children, my mother being the baby, and every one of them left the Torah way as they got older, as they got to be teenagers or young adults. And his parents had left him at age 6 and his little brother at age 5 in another country before airplanes or telegrams or fax machines or telephones for age 6 to age 11 years to study Torah. And he moved to America, and his family, as they say in Yiddish, went fry. They didn't keep it up. And he was devastated. So the Rebbe told Rabbi Hecht, he burst into tears. Rebbe burst into tears. And I promised him, Rabbi Hecht is saying to me, the Rebbe told me, I promised Rebbe, your grandfather, that he would have nachas from his einiklach, that he would have spiritual satisfaction and pleasure from his grandchildren. So how did that affect me and why? So first of all, the divine providence, that I had a ride to the retreat, that it was going to be my last Shabbos, that I would keep, that I, at the last moment, decided to show up for Shabbat at this family, that this event was happening the evening after, Saturday night, that this rabbi had come finally after being asked for 10 years for this date, the yahrzeit of the previous Rebbe, but never was able to come until now. That he started out by telling stories about the Baal Shem Tov and how the previous Rebbe quoted the Baal Shem Tov about Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence. That I was sitting there at that moment. What are the odds? Okay, then that he told these stories. He had about 6 or 7 stories. They were short, like one story. The only one I remember now is that he said a man used to come, a wealthy man, every year from another state, and he would, on his birthday, and he would ask the secretary if he could just take a glimpse of the Rebbe in his office, and the secretary would open the door and let him see the Rebbe working at his desk for just half a minute, and then he would close the door, and the man would say, "Wow, that's all I need for the year." Like stories like that, and then this long story with all these details, naming the names and everything else. So that's the Hashgacha Pratis, the divine providence, is unbelievable. Why did that happen? How did that happen? Next, that a Rebbe sees souls. It's not a joke. People don't know what exists in this world. We read stories, if we even do, about Moses, about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, people like that. And we think that's biblical, if we even think it exists. One time, I had a fairly well-known rabbi at my apartment in Jerusalem for Shabbat dinner, and he was saying to me and my husband, it says in the Torah that Mashiach will be greater than Avram Avinu, the patriarch Abraham. And he said, can you imagine greater than Avram Avinu? And I'm looking at my husband, and we're like, yeah, easily, because we lived with it. We saw it. So the Rebbe, before my parents were married, the previous Rebbe, saw the souls of their children and saw that we would return to our Jewish roots, to our Torah roots. Now, what had to happen before we were conceived, afterwards, in our lives, to create this date and to create this effect? It's beyond anything that normal human beings can possibly conceive, but it happened to me. So my destiny was following me around, waiting to be opened. Every event in my life. And I was a semi-atheist. I wouldn't say atheist. I was heavily agnostic, having issues believing there was a God, and also issues believing that if there was a God, that he cared anything about me. Well, that went right out the window on this fateful evening, forever. And the third thing is that the Rebbe planted a message like a time capsule. How is that possible? What makes that possible? Where he called this Rabbi Hecht, into his office after he met with my grandfather and told him things that should have been kept in confidence, theoretically, implanted in him a message to be delivered when the time came, the moment in time when everything was set. And he delivered it without having a clue. How does that happen? And I need to tell this story more because this story is unbelievable and it happened to me. And of course, it changed my life forever. After that, I moved to New York, which I was not willing to do. I didn't want to go to New York and live amongst people that I thought were like religiously suppressed. I saw truth. Truth hit me on the head and I couldn't deny it. And I didn't want to deny it. Maybe part of me did, but most of me didn't. Because when you see truth, when you see something that's so beyond this world, when you see that souls, I heard that I didn't see it. I didn't hear it directly from the Rebbe or see it in a text, but I did hear from good source that the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, and I think the predecessor, the Rebbe Rashab, if I'm not mistaken, spent 10,000 hours altogether determining which souls would come into their community to play a role, somehow spreading connection and Torah from them between that time and the coming of Mashiach. So we are all here. Every soul is here now. At least I heard this from Rabbi Avram Sutton. I'd never heard it before. I heard it just at the last summit that I did, that all soul, but it makes so much sense that every soul is back now because this is the grand finale. And even souls that have already left, people that we knew, they came back in this generation. This is the generation. The generation, according to Torah, corresponds with the leadership of the leader. The Rebbe is the last Rebbe, and he's the leader until Mashiach comes. So every soul is back to finish up. It's like the final mop up. Everything that we did that we need to learn from and rectify, everything that we failed to do that we need to make up for and do now. It's all here, and our lives are step by step, event by event, moment by moment, being orchestrated for us so that we can make those final tikkunim, those final rectifications. Hi, Tom. And it is so important that we do so. It is so important that people understand this. There's nothing more important. Nothing. And I know some people are very focused on white hats and black hats, and although I find it's getting more and more boring, I sort of am too. But white hats, black hats, presidents that we love and admire, that play a cosmic role, and anyone else who exists on the physical plane is a player in this vast cosmic chess match, this spiritual war. But the war, the events, the timeline, the opportunities, the soul journeys, all orchestrated by God, every single one. And for every single one of us. So I want to say, and this is how I put it, and I wrote this story up. It's if you want to look it up and get more details. I mixed up some of the events. Nobody gave me any feedback on how to tell it better. I would really like that, but you can look up my name, Shipra Hendry, and the words "the tapestry," and you can read the story in a more orderly way. But our lives really are like a giant tapestry. If you've ever seen a tapestry in a museum, the front of the tapestry is a beautiful picture, right? Of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe, of little strings, stitches. But if you look at the tapestry on the back, it's just knots and random strings and big gaps. You can't see the picture that it forms. Likewise, if you have a puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle of 5,000, 10,000 pieces, and you throw it on the floor, and some of the pieces are upside down and they're far away from the ones that they're supposed to be next to, and it's just completely jumbled and mixed up, and you have no idea what the picture is on the box if you don't have the box. The Torah is the box, by the way, but we have to dig into it, really dig into it, to find our piece and to really know. But be that as it may, every one of you, every one of us is a particular piece of this divine puzzle. Every soul is a piece. And you can't know, are you part of the tree? Are you a rose? Are you a chimney? Are you the gardener? Are you the puppy? In that puzzle, what are you connected to? What are you here for? You can't know until you know yourself. Although your life will still be directed like mine was. We all are. A tapestry is being woven and we're part of it. Each one of us is a thread, a divine thread. But once you know more about your purpose, once you know more about your piece of the puzzle, then you can see, who do you relate to? What are you part of? How can you contribute to that and make it more whole? And then ultimately, you know how it is when you start to put together a jigsaw puzzle, when you get the first two pieces, that feels good. The next piece, that starts to make like a pattern and as you build, it gets easier and easier and easier to bring the rest in. That's really, one take on what's happening here. But again, it's all the souls, the core of every soul is God. The very core. The soul has 5 general levels and, many more specific levels, perceptions. Not every part of the soul has divine consciousness or is infinite even. But the soul's like the light and the body's like the vessel. And the light can be very dimmed if the vessel's not very clear. But if you try to shine 60,000 amps through a 60-watt light bulb, it's not going to go very well. That's kind of how it is working for a lot of us, a lot of the time. But at the core of the soul, the core, that's called the Yechida. The word Yechida is connected to the word union or oneness, Yachid, singular, only. So the core of the soul is part of the onlyness of God, the core. And that's driving things. That's driving us as we go through our apparently, random free choice life. It's not actually like that. Although, that's how we play the game. We're given a lot of freedom. But at the same time, every encounter is arranged by God. There's nothing that is not. There's nothing left out, nothing random. Just like I had my entire life. My father got a job at the University of Minnesota as a professor. We moved to Minnesota. My brother somehow ended up in this community and started telling me things. We ended up riding our bikes there when this girl that I'd met in camp was there for the first day and came up and they happened to see me when I was standing in the foyer. I could go on and on and on. I won't. But if you think about a life, and if you actually entertain the possibility that your life is being orchestrated from above, like it says in the Torah, Hakol b'yedei shamayim chutz mi'yirah shamayim, everything is in the hands of heaven except for fear of heaven. What does that mean? Our moral choices are our own. But the steps that we take, the people we meet, even the thoughts that pop into our heads, those all come from above. You get a choice whether you you let them move in or you kick them out. But even the thoughts, every beat of your heart, you're not separate. But it's also not a theory. It's also not an idea. Oh, we're all one. I heard that so much when I was, hanging out, doing summits in the quantum healing, consciousness, and soul and the New Age movement. No, I enjoyed a lot of things about it, but it used to just drive me nuts when people would say, "Oh, we're all one. We're all God. You're God. I'm God." We're all godly at our core and in our potential. We're all one in that same core. But to make it, to reveal it, that's the potential. We're here to bring that potential into revelation in our world, in our physical lives. To bring that oneness into revelation, you really need to know what you're doing. You really need to be conscious. You really need to integrate these things and start and practice living with them. And it's a practice because we're not wired that way. We're wired a different way on purpose. It's all about the transformation. Anyway, I wanted to get on and tell that story. Now it's full dark, but it's still Yud Gimel Tammuz in a lot of the world. And the energy remains. Blessings back, Tom. How do you write a letter to the Rebbe? So it's a great question. So there are a couple of choices. There are a couple of easy choices. One is you can go to ohelchabad.com. I'm going to type that in the chat here. And you'll see clear instructions on how to write to the Rebbe. And you can send a letter, you can email a letter, you can fax a letter, you can you can mail a letter, you can call even. Someone will answer the phone. And you can ask for a blessing. But if you want to explain things, if you want to share information, you should write. Another way is, this is the way I often do it, is you can write online. You can submit a letter. There's a form on egrot.com. Egrot is the word for letters. So there are 30 something volumes of letters that are published. They're more than 30 actually. Maybe 40, 50, I don't know. But of letters, compilations of letters that the answers that the Rebbe sent to people who wrote to him. And those are published and they're in a random generator on this website, egrot.com. And you can actually send a letter. You can write a letter in English and you can specify English and you'll get a random generated answer from that website. And I don't know if this seems really strange to you or not, but oftentimes you will get an answer that is exact to what you're asking. And sometimes not. And that's not a surprise either because, even when we would write to the Rebbe and he was sitting in his office and not operating from a more spiritual realm, so sometimes he wouldn't answer. There were many times when I wrote a letter and gave it to the secretary, and he gave it to the Rebbe, and I'd go every day and say, "Is there an answer to my letter?" And the secretary would say, "Not yet, not yet." And sometimes I got an answer, and sometimes I didn't, and that was a known thing that happened to everybody. They said you always get an answer. Sometimes you get it verbally, and sometimes it just happens. You get it in the way that the world moves for you. But it's incredibly good to be connected to the Rebbe. There are incredible blessings in it. Incredible, because the Rebbe is the collective soul. So I see people are coming on, at least live. I guess anybody listening to the replay is going to hear the beginning. But I just want to stress again before I go for the day that we don't have a clue. 3 things really we don't have a clue about, and we need to. Number 1 is how crucial every one of our souls is to this enterprise. Everyone is carrying a mission, a piece of the mission, a piece of the puzzle. Just think about that puzzle of like 100,000 pieces and you get it all finished and the last one's missing. How is that? How does that feel? Not so good, right? So we're all here to fulfill our piece, to be our piece, and to connect to other pieces that we're meant to connect to. And that's crucially important. So every soul is here with a mission as part of this grand finale of human evolution, of this age, and stepping into a new age. I can't even count the number of times I personally heard the Rebbe say that we're the last generation of Galus, of exile, and the first of Geula, of redemption, which means we have both in us, which means we are brought back down in this swing time to move from one to the other, to reveal out of the old, the new, out of the darkness, the light, out of the separation, the connection. And like I said before, all souls are back now to do that, exactly that. The second thing that we don't understand is how our lives are orchestrated. And I just talked about that, so I'm not going to repeat. But every single move, every moment of time, every thought in our heads, every encounter that we have, every emotion that comes up, you don't have to suppress yourself and pretend to God, because God is catalyzing all of this in you. Why? A, to draw you to where you have to be to take your role, to do your part, to move your piece around the board. And B, to get you to connect. God wants to connect to all of us with love. And that's a switch. That's part of the redemption. God always loved us, but it didn't always look that way. Maybe sometimes it still doesn't. But right now we are in this time when we can turn darkness into light, when we are here to learn to do miracles. This is directly from the Rebbe. When we're here to connect with God in a completely different way, where if we can reach the level of trust, I have a link below this video, dailybitachon.com. Their lectures, and it's got nothing to do with me. I just started listening to it. It's a very dynamic person from Brooklyn. I think he's from Brooklyn, who's giving lessons on trust every day. And it's pretty inspiring if you can, deal with the Brooklyn. and the Hebrew, if you don't know Hebrew. But it's a guarantee that when we can get close enough to God, so close that we are relaxed and truly trusting, it's an emotional, energetic, vibrational state. It's not an idea in the mind. It's not like faith. Trust is much, much more personal. So it's a promise, it's a guarantee in the Torah that when we can get to that state, we will be protected in very human ways, not just mystical, but physical, practical. So we're here to get close to God. We're here to heal our relationship with God. It also starts with healing your relationship with yourself. Those are the two core relationships, you and God. So that's what your life is also about. And the third thing is there are souls. There is one in a generation, souls that come down to the world not to fix themselves, because they're not in need of fixing, but because they contain it as a body contains cells. These cosmic central souls, it's called in Hebrew neshama klalut, or neshamot klaliot. They're collective. It's called collective general souls, which they're like the over souls. I guess that would be the word, that contain in each of in their souls a spark of every single soul that exists. And likewise, every single soul contains at its core a spark of that collective soul. It's symbiotic, it's holographic. So those souls, like I just explained to you in my own personal experience, are connected to all souls before they're in bodies, while they're in bodies, after they're in bodies, have total direct influence, can implant messages to be delivered decades later, when at the moment that the time is right. And so many things that we can't possibly understand. And yet we are sparks of those souls. We're here for a different job right now. We have to be operating with blinders on, because we're here to elevate to do the final elevations, make the final connections as quote unquote ordinary human beings. And the central souls, tzaddikim, are here to help us. And they're just as present here, though we can't see them, as they were when we could see them, because their life force isn't like ours. It's not physical. Quoting the Tanya here, it is made up of love and faith and awe. And so that doesn't go away when the body is temporarily under the ground. All death is temporary. But when we connect to that central soul, we're connecting to our roots. We're connecting to our core. We're helping to activate that soul, and that soul is activating us, and that is bringing the world quantum leaps forward into the redemption fulfilled and revealed. And again, there's nothing more important than all of this now. Nothing. You think that the world's going to transform permanently because of military? I mean, everything is, I don't want to say a pawn, because it makes it sound like unimportant. No, everything is a vastly important, essential, central piece in God's cosmic chess game. And the more we know it, the more we connect, the more our personal lives change, the more our health changes, the more our souls have impact, the more our minds have impact, the more influence we get. But at the end of the day, everybody's going to have to know that it's God. That's what everything is for. And not like, oh, it's God, cower, big giant. No, God is, yes, a big giant force, to say the least. But God also wants to be known now, at this time, in personal and intimate ways. God wants our hearts, and our love. And he also needs our actions and our consciousness. And we're all in this together. Okay, that is my Yud Gimel Tammuz message. Thank you very much for being me. Let's just see if there's any other question. Yeah, keep those letters, Irma. Never let those go. Okay, thanks, guys. I'd love to. I didn't get any feedback from anybody. I'm just going to repeat that. Maybe I should just give it up. I feel very, for some reason, I have a hard time telling the story. So I'm looking for, what do you want to hear speed up? What do you want to hear slow down? Anyway, next time. Or you can always add your comments in chat. I'll see them. All right. Take care, everybody.